Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video today, we're going to talk about the two most important things you need to consider when determining whether or not an exercise is being performed correctly or not. You have heard the term proper technique, or you've seen somebody correct another person in the gym, for instance, say, well, they're not doing it, quote, correctly, or they're not doing sufficient range of motion. In any case, the question is always, how do you determine whether an exercise is being done correctly or, quote, incorrectly? Now, you notice that when I put it in those terms, it's either black or white, right? It's either correct or incorrect. Fact of the matter is that's actually not technically correct. Why? Because there is a range before you hit really incorrect, and a range of doing certain exercises in certain ways that are actually considered correct. And so I want to go over with you the two things that you need to consider anytime you're looking at exercises or anytime you're looking at your clients performing these exercises. Now, remember, as personal trainers, you've got to be very, very cognizant. I like to use the term hypervigilant when I'm training people. So when I have clients, whether it's one-on-one training clients or a small group training, 3, 4, or 5 individuals, one thing I'm always looking for is, quote, correct form or technique. But remember what I said, correct form, correct technique actually has a little bit of variety to it. In other words, although the range of motion is not all that it should be, just as a for instance, as long as I'm not hurting the joint or putting the joint in potential for injury, it's still technically correct. So what are these two things then? Because I kind of got into it just a little bit. Well, first and foremost is what we call biomechanics. Okay, and this deals with the joints and all the structures around a joint and those issues related to movement and the potential forces that are generated on the joint. So that's biomechanics. And mechanics obviously is a sub study in physics. And so we look at machines and we look at robotics and all these other subfields that help us to understand biological systems. And that's where the term biomechanics comes in. So essentially we're talking about joints, so the elbow and the shoulder. And so the first thing you got to keep in mind is, are the biomechanics done properly? I.e., are the muscles, right, that are supposed to be being worked? And more importantly, are the joints that are being worked over in a safe or unsafe position? In other words, are you locking out a joint and putting it under undue stress or tension, for instance? Or are you moving a joint through a range of motion that is no longer effective on the muscle? So biomechanics basically tells us, are you going to hurt the joint or not? So that's number one. I'll give you a perfect example of the injury component of this. If I'm doing dumbbell curls, just as a for instance, we know biomechanically that as soon as the elbow locks out, that there is a potential, especially if you're holding a dumbbell and you come down to a position where the elbow locks out, that could be potentially dangerous on the elbow. It's one of the reasons why we tell folks when you're coming down on a dumbbell curl, just don't lock all the way out. In other words, you keep the elbow bent slightly when you get to the, quote, bottom position. But we know just from a mechanical perspective, because of the way the humerus connects with the ulnar and the radius of the forearm bone, that as soon as you go into a lockout, into what we call a fully closed packed position at the elbow, once that happens, although the joint, that elbow joint, is in a very stable position, the problem is that as soon as I try to curl back up, the level of stress placed on the tendons from the bicep itself is now inordinate and unnecessary and potentially creates chronic issues at the elbow. So again, first and foremost, look at the joint. What is the joint capable of doing? And under loads, when the muscles are working and contracting, is it safe, or is there a potential injury issue that could happen if I, in this case, lock out. Now, let me give you another example from biomechanics to help you understand where there is not an issue necessarily with the injury part of this. But for instance, if I'm doing lateral raise, this idea of the range of motion, biomechanics at the shoulder being too much or too little is readily apparent. If I was to take dumbbells and hold them at my side and lift them up and out to the side like a lateral raise, more than likely 9 out of 10 people looking at me perform a lateral raise like this from here to here would say that I'm doing it correctly. But what if I lifted my arm up even higher? What would people say? They would probably say, well, you're going up too far. Now, I wouldn't disagree, but it's not because of biomechanics, okay? Fact of the matter is there's no issue for injury, right? Even the idea that I could be putting compressional stress in the glenoid from the humeral head really is not that much, okay? Even if I go this much higher through abduction, it's not really that significant. What is significant about going higher than roughly parallel to the ground is that the deltoid is already shortened to its maximum length. So an individual could say, well, you don't need to go up as far, but there's not an injury issue like when I do a dumbbell curl, or if I go down in a squat. If I go down too low in a squat, how do I know I'm doing the exercise incorrectly, right? My technique is poor. Well, my pelvis tucks underneath. I get that butt tuck, right? I lose the arch in my lower back. That's potential for injury. So that's number one. So this is all biomechanics. You'll notice I didn't say anything about the quads or the hamstrings. Of course, I mentioned the deltoid. But again, biomechanically inside the shoulder joint, going from here to here, no issue. Going from here to here, there ain't no issue right there either. There really is no injury issues that are going to occur unless I internally rotate. Totally different subject. But if I keep a neutrally rotated position or even externally rotate slightly, there's no injury issue potential if I go up to this point with a lateral raise, okay? So number one, biomechanics. Biomechanics is always going to look at the joint itself. Is the joint potentially under undue stress or tension? Is the position that the joint is being put into potentially a problem, especially if you're using excessive loads? Okay, so that's the first one, biomechanics. Got that, right? Well, what's the second issue that tells me whether or not I'm doing the exercise correct or my technique is off? Well, this has to do with the level of tension on the muscle. Keep in mind, when we're talking about personal fitness training and exercise technique and performance, we are talking about targeting in the resistance training component of it. We're talking about targeting muscles themselves. So the focus and goal of any exercise is to do what? In the resistance training component. I'm not talking about calisthenics and I'm not talking about your warm-up. I'm not talking about your cardio. That's totally different. But the second thing to consider here is during the resistance training component of your workout, the target muscle is the primary focus. Am I keeping consistent tension on the muscle throughout the exercise itself? So I am technically doing the exercise correct as long as I am keeping tension on the muscle without what? Creating undue stress on the joint. So remember, biomechanics, second is muscular tension. If I'm doing dumbbell curls, what is the point of doing dumbbell curls? To train my biceps. Now, I will say this as a little aside. I can do dumbbell curls for a very different reason, and I do it almost every day. Well, not every day, but most days. My workouts consist of a lot of cardio and intermittent cardio training while I'm doing my resistance training. So what I do is I grab a 5 or 10 pound dumbbell and I'm on my spin bike and I'll spin out to get my heart rate up, and I'll use the dumbbell curls and lateral raises with very light weight to increase my heart rate. Very effective way to do that, by the way. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. I'm not doing it to train my biceps. Does that make sense? But when it's back and bicep day and I'm doing dumbbell curls, it's not to raise my heart rate. It's to do what? It's to train the muscle. Okay, so let's go back. Biomechanics, muscular tension in the target muscle. when I do squats and I'm doing it on my resistance and I've got weight on my back, or I'm doing lunges and I'm holding, it is because I'm training my quadriceps and my glutes mainly. How do you know you're doing the exercise correctly then? Well, as long as you are maintaining tension on the muscle for the most part consistently throughout the range of motion for the entire repetition and number of reps you're doing in a particular set, then technically you're doing the exercise correctly, which takes us back to this idea of a lateral raise. If I was to simply take dumbbells and go from here, for instance, to here, am I doing the exercise correctly? Now, this is where folks get confused, because you might look and say, well, you're not getting a quote full range of motion, but that's not the criteria, is it? I would say, sure, more if you get a greater range of motion, yes, you would be working the deltoid a little bit harder. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, though. Hope that makes sense. It's not incorrect. This is not incorrect technique on a lateral raise. You'll notice that from here, I'll just use one arm, from here to here, is my deltoid under tension? Absolutely. Are there any issues at the shoulder joint? Nope. So I could go from here to here and I can say I'm doing that exercise correctly. Now, again, that is technically correct. I would probably suggest that an individual increase the range of motion a little bit, but I hope you get the idea. First off, biomechanics. Are you going down too low on the squat? Are you locking the elbow out during a dumbbell curl? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Look at the joint itself and ask those questions. Am I compromising the integrity or safety of the joint? That's the first thing. The exercise is incorrect. Your technique is incorrect if you get to a point or you're doing a movement pattern where the joints that are being worked over are potentially going to be injured, or there's going to be some sort of chronic inflammation condition over time that can occur. So, right. So that's the biomechanics. And what was the second one? Muscular tension. Are you maintaining tension on the muscles while you're doing the exercise? Technically, the exercise is being done improperly, incorrectly, even though there's no issue safety-wise, but the exercise is being done incorrectly if at some point during the movement pattern, you lose resistance on the muscle. What's a classic example of that? Well, a perfect one is when you're doing lateral raises, and we see this all the time. Let me step back for just a little bit. If I have dumbbells, right? If I have my dumbbells right here and I let them all the way down and then let them to the front, like you see a lot of people doing it, well, technically that's incorrect because I lost tension on my deltoid. Well, the tension goes up into my traps. What about bicep curls? Another classic example. If I take a dumbbell, I've got a lot of tension on my bicep. I don't lock my elbow out, but I got tension on my, and as I pull it up, what happens? Torque essentially is negated, goes to zero as soon as I get up to a certain point. So if I go even further up like this, what have I done? There's no injury issues. I'm not going to hurt my elbow by coming up all the way like this with a dumbbell. Now, I know some people squeeze and that's okay. That's fine. But just by coming up, I lose tension in my bicep. That's why, by the way, people squeeze their bicep at the top because there's no tension. It ain't doing anything for the peak on your bicep. It's totally ridiculous. But point is that from a technique perspective, if I want to be really, right, be a purist about this, that's incorrect. Coming up to this point and then losing tension and doing this, even though technically that's improper technique. Okay. Once again, there is this ideal scenario that we come up just to the point where tension is maintained and then we go back down. I'll give you another great example on the squat. If you go down in a squat and you maintain the lordotic curve and you maintain the anterior tilting of your pelvis, you don't allow your butt to tuck up underneath, and you come down to that bottom position and you stop and then you come up smooth and controlled, there's going to be a point where you don't feel tension any longer on the quadriceps. Okay. In other words, you go up and you lock out at the top. Now, again, I know some people squeeze their glutes. I get it. I don't recommend that, but some people do it. Technically, from a purely mechanical perspective, there's not that much of an injury issue if you kind of go all the way up and you don't even lock your knee at the top. but you get close. But what are you missing at that point? There's no tension on your quads. And so technically, again, it's improper technique to go all the way up. Just like in the bicep curl, the reason people squeeze their glutes at the top is because there's no tension at a certain point. This comes down to this idea of range of motion, which we'll talk at a later date. But I just wanted to make sure you got those two things. If you've never thought about proper technique or even considered it, you just kind of feel your way through it and you look at your clients and you tell them to do A, B, C, or D. Well, I hope that this video helps you to be a little bit more cognizant about what proper technique is. It is proper biomechanics, i.e., no injury issues, no potential compromising the integrity or strength or ability of the joint to do its proper motion under the loads that are being imposed on it, right? So biomechanics, that's one huge issue when it comes to proper technique. And the second one is the muscle tension development component. Are you keeping tension on the muscle? So look, go out there, do it yourself. I mean, that's the way I used to figure all this stuff out, was just doing it on myself. Do it yourself and then do it with your clients. And you will notice a drastic change in the way your clients feel from their workouts. When all of the tension is placed on the muscle through its limited, ranges of motion without hurting the joint, without compromising joint integrity, it's a whole nother ball game. People will really feel the workouts and they won't have to use as much weight in order to accomplish that. Look, I hope that this little tip that I gave you, these two things, right, when it comes to proper exercise technique, is helpful to you. Remember, we are going to be talking about other topics related to how you can be the best personal trainer in the industry. I mean, that's what we do here at Body Design University. We educate and help trainers to be leaders in the personal training industry. Please, if you haven't done so, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You go ahead and that ring the bell thingy, right? Whatever that does, so you can find out when our new content is coming out. Check out our Facebook group and just let us know in the comment section below if you have any questions. Let me know specifically if this is helpful. These techniques that I just told you about are helpful. And if you have specific questions that we can address in a future video. Have a great weekend and we'll see you next week.